Welcome. For this lesson, you should follow along as we recreate this object that you see on the screen here as an introduction to Fusion 360. When you first open Fusion 360, you should see an empty workspace similar to this. This is one of the many workspaces that Fusion 360 includes. We're in design right now, which is where we'll stay for most of this curriculum. Some important navigation things right off the bat: to zoom in and out, get a closer or further view, you scroll the center mouse wheel. If you want to move around left and right, you can hold down the center mouse wheel and drag the whole mouse. That's panning. And if you want to orbit and change your three-dimensional perspective, add Shift on the keyboard with the center mouse wheel, click down, and then move the mouse. Zoom, pan, and orbit can also be found down here in this lower toolbar if you prefer to click on those. You can also orbit by clicking and dragging this cube in the upper right-hand corner, or clicking on the particular face that you want to snap and look directly down on. You can also rotate by 90 degrees, or even select some of the corners and vertices as well. If you're ever lost, you can click the home button to return back to the original view. Another thing that's important for navigation is the browser over here, which we'll use to organize all of the sketches and three-dimensional bodies of our object together into separate components. We'll talk more about this as we work through our project, but the first thing that we're going to do is create this big lower part of our object. We'll make this one component. To create a new component, you want to right-click on the highest level and go to New Component. And that puts it there in the browser for us. You'll notice that this circle to the right has been filled in, indicating that that's the active thing that we're working on. It's no longer this top level. And to create this three-dimensional object, we're going to begin with a sketch of a two-dimensional face, which will extrude or pull upwards into three-dimensional space. So the sketch tool is up here in the menu bar left-hand side, and the first thing you need to do is to select what plane you want to sketch on. If you're ever unsure what the tool is asking you to do, if you stop moving your mouse like I just did, you'll see that it gives you a little text indication of what you should do next. I'm going to select this one back here, which is the XY plane, but I also want to use this as a chance to show you another trick here. If that plane I wanted to select was inside an object or out of reach, I couldn't get my cursor onto it, you've got a trick here. Right now I'm on the ZX plane, this front square, but I see underneath is the XY plane. If I left click and just hold my mouse down for a second, I get this option to select a different type of geometry that's buried underneath. And so I can move my mouse up and down here to see which one it is. So there's the XY. I'll click on that. It automatically snaps to a straight down view for us, so that's convenient. If you accidentally orbit away from that, you can always use the cube to return to that view. The bottom feature that we have here is actually a cube, so I just need to make a square for the base that I can pull upwards. You've got a rectangle tool that we could use here, but I like to, as often as possible, keep my design kind of centered around the origin. This particular rectangle tool is drawn by snapping one corner to the other, but it doesn't really define where the center is. You'll notice that underneath this, I've got a whole lot more options for sketching different things, including a rectangle that is defined from its center. So I'm going to use that. I should also point out up here that we've got new options. These are different from what we had in the three-dimensional view. You've got tools such as adding the fillet, which is that curved edge, or trimming away lines, doing an offset inside or out of an existing feature, and more hidden in the drop-down menu. You've got some constraints that you can add or modify for the parametric design, and some more tools over here. This top-level one for inspect will give you a distance between two objects that you click on, which can often be useful. So I selected the center rectangle tool again. You'll notice that my cursor has a little extra picture attached to it now to indicate that's the tool I'm using. Also, the sketch palette over here has updated. If I realized I didn't want the center defined rectangle, I could switch that to one of the other options here. Or turn on or off some of the other features of this, like having it automatically snap to the grid. The first click is to define the center point, and then as I drag that out, you'll see that right now we're kind of free form. I can do this more fluidly if I want to, but if I want to be precise, I should use the keyboard. I'm going to make this 2 millimeters or 20 2 centimeters or 20 millimeters on each side. So I entered 20 there, and the default units are in millimeters. I'm going to move to the other length by hitting Tab on the keyboard and making that 20 as well. So 2 centimeters on each side. Lastly, I'll hit Enter on the keyboard to commit both those changes. What we have now is a two-dimensional object on a plane, and I'll talk about a few of the things that we had here. One, you'll see there's dotted lines and solid lines. The solid lines are actually like features of your design. The dotted lines are called construction lines. So they're not subdividing this face. This face is still considered one face. If these were solid lines, then it would consider those to be smaller subregions. If you want to change one of these lines into a solid line, you can select it and click over here on the sketch palette to make it a part of your design. Now this is divided into two halves. You could also right click on this, and one of the options here in our wheel is to switch its state down here. With these other lines here, these are the dimensions that it automatically added. You can click and drag these to move them around if they're in your way. These lines here aren't actually part of the design, they just indicate the points between which we're measuring this distance. You can use this to also resize your cube or shape after you placed it. If I double click on that number, I can make this something smaller like 15 and hit Enter, and it resizes automatically. You'll notice since I used a center defined rectangle, it's squeezed in from both sides to keep the rectangle on that axis. I'm going to undo that change with Control Z on the keyboard to go back to a square. The parametric design here, the fact that we've got some constraints, you'll see that explains these extra little features that are hovering in various places. These double lines, for example, indicate that there's a parallel relationship. If I hover over the line or the symbol here, it'll kind of give a dull highlight to the line down below, letting me know that that's what it considers it to be constrained to. Those are parallel. I'm going to go up to the Modify tool here and select Trim to show how we can break some of these constraints that are in place right now. If I remove a couple of those construction lines, I got a brief warning down here telling me that one of those constraints has now changed. I'll hit Escape to get out of the Trim tool and go up to the dimensions one more time and reduce it to 15 like we did before. You see this time, because the rectangle wasn't defined at its center, it didn't adjust it in a way that kept all of those constrained relationships true. So I'm going to do Control Z, Control Z, Control Z to get back to the first square that we dropped here. We'll leave it at that. The next thing we're going to do is finish this sketch by clicking the right hand tool. When you do that, your menu bar will change up here to objects or options that are more appropriate to three-dimensional views. I could even orbit a little bit to see that we do in fact just have a two-dimensional square drawn on a plane. We're going to do the next step of making this three-dimensional by pulling that base square upwards into space. That's an extrusion. There's a tool up here right next to Sketch because they're really commonly used. You can also do the shortcut on the keyboard of typing E, which I just did. When I type E, since there was only one face selected here, it automatically applied it to that. If this hadn't been selected, I could click on it to make sure that's the case. You'll notice we got this dialog box that popped up. You usually get one of these for every tool that you use. And these are some of the options and things that we can change here. For example, I could change where we're starting our extrusion from. Is it right from this plane, or do I want to have it slightly above, like an offset plane? Do I want it to go just in the direction that I pull with this arrow, or do I want it to be symmetrical in both directions? Extent, I can have it go all the way up to another object or to a value that I type in, etc. Down here, this operation will be more important to pay attention to as we add more bodies to our design. For example, if we're extruding off of a face of a three-dimensional body, we probably want it to join to it. If we push it in, we might want that to be a cut. We can also be left behind with the difference between the two, which is an intersect, or just have it be a brand new body, since that's all we have right now. We don't have a body. So I'm going to make this a cube. We've got 20 millimeters on a side, which means I need to go up 20 millimeters here. It's easiest if I just type in on the keyboard 20 and then hit enter. Now that's committed. We've got our starting cube there, which is the larger part of our design on the base here. We're going to add some of these smaller features in a minute. Let's use this time to look back at our browser and explore some of the things that are in here. First of all, this new component, which is the active one we've been working in, is just called the default name. It's always a good idea to stay organized by giving these names. If you double click on that, you can give it a more descriptive name like lower cube to keep track of it as your design gets more complicated. There was a little eyeball symbol to the left of some of these. That's a way to hide or show various features in your design. Can help keep things from getting too complicated or not being included. If you don't want these lines to be snapped to later on as you're editing stuff, you can always hide it so that that doesn't happen. If I open up this component, we'll see that it's creating some folders as we go for the different types of things that we've done. Remember that we first created a sketch before we extruded, and right now it's not visible because the eye is turned off. I can turn that back on. Now I can see that sketch that we created. This would be particularly useful to turn on if I wanted to use those reference lines later. Also, we have bodies. Bodies are the three-dimensional objects created after an extrusion, which I can individually hide or hide the entire group. And there's an origin specific for this shape that we created. It may or may not be the same as the larger origin of the whole project. When we first started out in the highest level here, we had 3 folders that already existed. Taking a look closely at those, the first one is a chance for you to change dimensions if you wanted to be in inches or meters instead of millimeters. That's a way to do that there. There's also some other view options here that are named. We can go to top, for example, or the front. They're the same as some of the things on the cube there, but you can also use this to create your own views. If I wanted to have a close-up view of this corner, for example, that I can continually return to, I could right-click on the named views, add a new view, and give it a distinctive name. Again, double-clicking on here to edit it. I could call it the corner view. Now when I go away, I can always return right to that close-in view instead of having to use my pan and orbit tools all the time. And then the last thing, of course, is the origin. You can be really specific about whether you want the entire origin shown or just particular planes or axes of it. All right, for the next part, we're going to create the second smaller rectangular prism that was sitting on top here. This would be a good time to practice putting things into new components. So I right-clicked the highest level and selected new component. I'll rename it right away. I know it's going to be the upper cube. I'll call it a cube even though it ends up being a rectangular prism, and hit enter to commit that. The thing you'll notice is our large cube is now grayed out. That's because the active component we're working on is indicated with this filled in circle, and that's going to be the one that is actively filled in solid. If I go back to the first one, we see that it is in fact the same as we left it, but graying it out allows us to not have it block what we're working on. We're going to create our three-dimensional object here very similar to how we created the big one by creating a sketch. Now that I've got more than just the origin, I've got some faces of this cube that I can select. We're going to put it up on top, so I'll click that and it snaps to the view right away to help us out. The object itself is located not in the center, not on the edge. It's kind of in the middle of this upper quadrant, somewhere right in the middle here. And that can be a hard thing to find. If I tried to make a rectangle over in here, it's not really clear where that center point is. You'll notice that it likes to snap to the grid points, and if I've got some predefined lines already in my design, it'll snap and follow along those. If I don't get these helpful green lines, you can also try going back to a really clear point like this midpoint line indicated with that triangle, and then drag outwards from there. Even if I go away and return back to there, it'll still show me that even though I'm distant, that's that same midpoint. This would be a good time for us to practice using some construction lines to help us find the middle of this face. So I'm going to hit escape to get out of that rectangle tool that I grabbed, and I'm going to switch to a line tool instead. Before I start drawing a line across the center here that I can use to find the middle, I'm going to make it a construction line here in the palette. Then I'll click and drag across. Since it allowed me to snap to the center in the corner, that's easily defined. You'll notice now I can find the midpoint of that line, which would be smack dab in the middle of this square. That'd be a good place to use my center rectangle tool. I'm going to go back to the options here and select that rectangle. What I've done right now is a mistake I commonly make is as I start to draw this, you'll notice it's a dotted line. I left it in construction, and I actually want these to be real features. So I'll hit escape. I'll go back over here and turn off that construction tool, and then begin my sketch. Alright, so there's the center point of that line. I can pull this out, and we'll just make this a smaller shape. I'll go 5 by 5 millimeters in both directions. Hit enter to submit those changes, and it's got the same constraints as the rest of the design here. Now we're going to extrude this up into three-dimensional space. You don't need to necessarily use the finish sketch tool. If I press E on the keyboard, it'll finish the sketch for me and already have the extrusion tool pulled up. So I'll click this, and we'll make it a perfect cube by going 5 millimeters upwards. I hit enter to submit that change. At this point, we can go back to the highest level here and make this the active component. That way we can see what this looks like with both bodies filled in gray. Got a few more steps to do, including adding this circle, which we'll tackle next. It's pushed into the face, so you'll notice this is a cut that we're making into the face. I'm going to go back to the upper cube, the one that we just made, the smaller shape, and begin from here. What I'm intentionally going to do is make a mistake that is a common snafu, and then we'll go back and we'll do it the correct way. So to create that circle on the face, we'll begin as we did before by creating a sketch, selecting that face that we want to work on. We'll make a circle in the middle of this face, which I'm not quite sure if I'm in the middle here, but I can find that. I know it would be the midpoint of this line and the midpoint of this line. Because I've hovered over both of those, I get some gray lines or green lines that come down, a little bit easier to see here, letting me know that I'm in the dead center. I'll type in 5 millimeters to commit that change, and then I'll press E to extrude. We've got a lot of faces here, so I need to select the one that I'm extruding. You can always select multiple faces if you want to extrude, and if you accidentally select the wrong one, just click it again to unselect it. I'm going to grab the arrow here to pull this in or out, and I'm wanting to go into the face for that hole. Let's just go in 1 millimeter, so it's -1. I'll press enter. If I take a look at this with both of the parts solid, we see that it didn't actually create a hole in that bottom part. And the mistake that I made here is that I was still working in the upper cube component, not the lower cube component. So turning off the lower cube, we see that it's created a new body down there instead of making a cut, a subtraction. So I'm going to undo all those changes with Control Z, and we'll go back and do it the right way. Control Z, Control Z. All right, back to this step. So before I start making that circle, I'm going to switch to the lower cube component by filling in this circle here. We'll do the exact same thing that we just did, make a sketch on that face, do a circle that is in the center, and we'll find the center by dragging over from those midpoints. I'll pull this out 5 millimeters, hit enter to commit that. I'll press E to switch to the extrusion tool. I'll select the circle, and I'll go in -1 millimeter. You'll notice that it's made that inside shape there red, indicating that it's in the negative direction. And Fusion 360 is pretty smart. It knows that it doesn't want to create a new object inside or a new body inside of a body that already exists. So it's changed this to cut. You could always force that change to be something else if you wanted to, but cut is what we were trying to do. So I'll press OK to commit that change. Now that looks correct. We've got that pushed in shape there. As a final step here, we'll add the curves on the outside edge, the fillets, and we'll add this little cone-shaped inward scoop here called the chamfer to the face. I'm also going to show how we could combine these two objects together if we want to simplify our life a little bit. The fillet tool is up here when we're in 3D view, so I'll select it right there. And I could add a fillet to an individual edge by clicking the edge and then pushing or pulling on this arrow, or typing in a specific amount. Or if I escape out of that, go back to the fillet tool, I can select the entire face and push in on the arrow. It'll add the fillet all the way around to all the edges connected to that face. You'll notice what it isn't doing is adding the fillet, the upward scoop on the small box here, and that's because that's a separate component. That body isn't part of the component that we're actively working in. I want to show that we can actually combine these two together and make them be one body, so that it adds all those fillets all at once. If I open up the browsers here for both those components and look at the two bodies that we have, this is the lower body, this is the upper body. If I select both of them by clicking on it and then holding down Control on the keyboard and clicking on the second one, I've now selected those both. I can go to the Modify menu here, and we've got Combine. It opens up a box here. If I hadn't selected both the bodies before, it would prompt me to do that next. And we could always change if we want this to be a cut or a join. We could even make it as a new component. If I hit OK, what it's going to do is make it one single body in the component that I first selected the body in. If I'd clicked on the lower body first and then selected the upper body, it would make this a single body in the lower component. We see that that's helpful with the fillet tool here now. If I click on this face, pull on there, it'll add the fillets that we want on all of the edges. Notice if I go too far, we do get an error because those fillets collide. So we can only go so far. I'll leave it at 1 millimeter. I hit enter to commit that change, and now we've got the scoop on the top. Lastly, we'll add the chamfer to the bottom. It's not shown in the most commonly used tools up here, but it is under Modify, and chamfer just gives us that sharp edge instead of a curve. It says that we need to select the edge to chamfer, so I'll select that circle, and again, just being freehand here, I'll push it in a little bit until it looks good. 0.5 millimeter. I'll hit enter for that. So we're almost at the exact same design that we created before. One of the last things I wanted to show is that this isn't actually a cube on the top, it's a rectangular prism. With the good parametric design here, we can always go back and edit the sketch that created this shape originally, and it'll update both the extrusion and all these fillets that we've done afterwards. So that's the upper cube. I can open up the sketch, and I can go back into this sketch by right-clicking it and going down to Edit Sketch. If I wanted to make this a little bit narrower, instead of 5, we could go down to 3 millimeters. I'll hit Enter there, and then finish the sketch. We see that it correctly updated both the extrusion that happened after that and the fillets that were applied to that extrusion. If you didn't follow along with the video up till this point, you should now go to your own Fusion 360 and try to follow along and recreate this shape, referencing this video if you run into any issues.